This is a review of the Hyperpro aftermarket springs and shock for the KTM 390 Adventure. The number one question I will be answering, is it worth the expense? Hey, how's it going? Welcome to my channel. If you haven't done it yet, do that thing down below. This is a review of the Hyperpro aftermarket progressive springs and the shock with the progressive spring on the shock. Now, I'm going to break this up into 4 sections. So I'm going to go through the reasons why I upgraded the springs, the reasons why I upgraded the shock, and then the setup of the spring, setup of the shock, of where I have them. I'm not going to do anything on the installation. I've already done videos on that. I'll link those in the description below. So if you want to go see what the installation requires, you can check it out there. And then I will talk about what has happened, how the bike performs on the road with the new springs and shock. And then I will also talk about how, more importantly, it performs off-road. So I know that's going to be what most of you are interested in, is how the suspension performs off-road. And then at the end, I will give you my overall assessment of this combination and whether or not it is worth the $2,000 that I put into the suspension on this bike. So if that interests you, stick around. The reason I replaced the springs is the stock springs are extremely undersprung for, I think, even the bike. And then you add my weight and I add other stuff to it, it just wasn't cutting it. The static sag of the stock springs just under the weight of the bike was somewhere between 35 and 40%. And then when I got to riding it, then the sag was even more than that. And I found that I was blowing through the travel on the fork very, very frequently. So I ended up having to turn in the compression adjustment to almost its max to try to slow down how fast the forks were compressing to try to keep it from bottoming. But then, you know, I'm all the way turned in. I have nothing more I can do. The rebound was turned almost all the way out so that I would get a faster response from it. It wasn't a good setup. And as most bikes coming off of the showroom floor are going to be undersprung because the manufacturers are trying to make a bike that fits a very wide range of riders, I had to do something with this. And that was going with the progressive springs from Hyperpro. Now, I already did the installation. I'll leave a link to that in the description, as I had mentioned before. What that did is, after getting the new springs put in, I was able to keep the compression adjustments to about the midpoint. So I was able to back it off from where I had it at full. And then I was also able to tune in some rebound, because now it actually did rebound quite quickly. And to keep some of that bounce out, I tuned it in. So it really improved how the front end felt. And I will go into how that was on-road and off-road. Okay, let's talk the rear shock. Now, the number one reason I had to replace it is I blew out 2 of the stock shocks. Now, I went through some of the reasons why that occurred. I think some of it has to do with all the heat that was coming off the resonator. The other thing is they're very inexpensively built shocks, and I was using it to probably beyond what its intended purpose was with the off-road riding and with it being loaded and pushing this bike to its limits. Now, that was one of the reasons why I had to replace the shock. The other is I wanted to get a shock with more adjustments. The stock shock is a very simple, I think it might even be a 1 flow circuit path on the shock itself. So your adjustment that is supposed to be for compression is also equal to rebound. Now with this shock, I have high and low compression adjustments as well as rebound. So it gives me a lot more tunability. The spring is better suited for my weight, and now I have a hydraulic adjustment for preload. I absolutely hated the preload adjustment on the other shock. It was a collar with a wrench. It was really a pain in the butt. I ended up, because it was so difficult to adjust, I would just put it at its full setting, because 80% of my riding was fully loaded, and I would just leave it, which meant that when I wasn't loaded, it was a little bit harsher ride. not ideal, but just because it was such a pain in the butt. Now with this setup, it makes it a lot easier. I have the high-speed compression damping turned up probably about 3/4 of the way. It's more than half, not quite full, somewhere in the 2/3 to 3/4 of the way of the adjustment, because I want this to be able to soak up all of the big hits. And then also the low speed compression, it's dialed out a little less than half because I want it to be more compliant on just smoother terrain where there's just small bumps and undulations, so that it just feels a little bit more comfortable for me. So those are the reasons, and I changed the springs and the shock and the setup for those. Now changing the shock out was pretty simple. It's an easy job to do. All right, how does the Hyperpro suspension, springs, fork springs, and shock feel on the road? In the simplest terms possible, it feels amazing. It is really turned this bike into having a much more sporty feel and a much more controlled feel. Also, it feels much more planted on the road, especially when doing a lot of cornering. Now, I think the simplest way to put it is because of the progressive nature of the springs and then having actual adjustment on the compression and rebound. From the front end side of things, when you're braking, you have much more control over how much compression or how much weight shift that you have towards the front of the bike, so that when you're going into corners, you're braking, you can feel that and then be able to control how much that happens. With the old springs, when you would get on the brakes, they had a tendency just to plow through the travel, where here it's much more controlled, so you can have that controlled weight shift onto the front tire, so you can have better braking. It also makes it much better for trail braking, going in and out of corners, because you can control that compression and that weight shift. Now the rear, because I have the low speed compression damping fairly soft, it's moving back and forth up and down through the travel, maintaining contact. I had noticed on the other shock it was pretty harsh in order to get it to feel the way I needed it to, and then when I softened it up too much, the rear end would start to wallow around, so it wasn't a great feel. This has a very, very sporty feel. Now I keep my suspension pretty tight, fairly stiff, and not very comfortable for road riding, because I want it to be able to absorb a lot of the off-road hits. But with that being said, this thing handles really well. Now, one important note is that it really depends on the kind of tires you have, because if you have knobby tires like I have on now, that will also affect how the bike handles in and out of corners and braking distance, things like that. So yes, the suspension makes a huge difference, but you do have to keep in mind that if you have a more street oriented tire, the bike will feel a little bit different than if you have an off-road oriented tire like I have. But overall, the amount of control that I have with the fork springs and shock is much higher. I've noticed that when I make mistakes going into corners, maybe I didn't cut it enough or I'm a little too tight, this is a lot more forgiving than I found it was before. If I'm letting off the brakes or releasing some of the pressure on the brakes, there isn't the teeter-totter effect that I was feeling with the previous setup. So from a road handling standpoint and just having more control, being safer and more forgiving, this is definitely an improvement over the stock suspension. How does the suspension work off-road? Well, that's where I have noticed the biggest difference between the springs and the shock, just the overall feel of the bike. Some of what I said on the on-road performance is equal to the off-road. It is smooth things out from a braking standpoint. It's much more controlled, especially in loose conditions. You want that control. You don't want that quick weight shift. That quick weight shift can result in front tires washing out. So having that much more controlled, that slower weight shift, using the brakes and not having that brake dive makes a huge difference off-road. So the springs, the front forks, I don't blow through those like I used to. If I bottom the springs out, it's because I've been going way too fast, or I saw a hole, I missed seeing a hole, I haven't read the terrain right. If I'm riding within, a reasonable pace, then that just doesn't happen. Now the rear shock, it smooth things out because the low speed compression damping is pretty open, and then the high speed, when I'm doing silly things like fully loaded wheeling off of water bumps, it'll take it, and I haven't bottomed it out. Now, there was a section on the Mid-Atlantic BDR that had like 5 or 6 of these, and I was wheeling off each one of them. There was not one time that I actually felt it bottom out. I was probably using most of the suspension, but it wasn't a harsh bottom. The shock has helped keep the rear tire in traction as well, especially over rough terrain. It's able to match that and make for a much smoother, controlled ride. Now, I will say that with this suspension setup, I'm able to ride much faster than I was before because the bike stays in control and it's much more forgiving. I'm not sure there's a whole lot else I can say about the feel of this off-road other than it makes a huge difference. Everything's smoother, much more controlled, and even if I make a mistake and pick a bad line, the bike can take it now, and I'm not gonna have significant consequences for that. So that's the off-road piece of it. It makes a big difference. Let's answer that question I started off with at the beginning of this video. Is it worth spending $2,000 on the progressive fork springs and the premium rear shock with high and low compression adjustment, rebound adjustment, and the hydraulic preload adjustment? And the answer from my standpoint is it is absolutely worth it because of the change that it does to this bike. The bike was really fun before, but when you get a suspension that's set up for your weight and your type of riding and you can adjust it to fit what works for you, it makes a difference. Oh no. If you have not ridden a bike that is properly set up for you with the spring rates and some adjustments where you can adjust the bike to fit your style of riding, you are really missing out. Now, this bike was fun to ride even before I put the suspension on, but putting the suspension on really took it from being a fun bike to a fantastic bike. It is extremely sporty on the road and off-road. It has made it such a better ride, a much better experience, much more controlled ride, and if I want to ride at some pace, it can handle it. It has been an absolute blast doing this. So I highly recommend, if you have the extra resources and you really want to take your KTM 390 Adventure to the next level, the suspension is probably one of the best ways to do that. So let me know what your thoughts are on this, if it's something you're considering but maybe weren't ready for it and this has helped you make that decision. Also, if you have made suspension adjustments, whether it be with fork springs or maybe a different shock and you want to share that experience with people, leave that in the comments below as well. So thanks for watching. Get out, do some riding, ride safe, and I will see you out there. This feels really weird. Test, 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 test.